In the Syndicate's world, invisibility was not a curse. It was the only armor Brigid Calloway had ever known how to wear. She had built it carefully, methodically, over 4 years of early mornings and late nights in the glass tower that housed Varoff Capital's Montreal headquarters. She arrived before the cleaners. She left after the security guard on the night shift, a retired cop named Henri, had already started his second thermos of coffee. She kept her dark hair pinned back in the same practical knot every single day. She wore navy and charcoal and the occasional deep burgundy, colors that said competent and forgettable in the same breath. She had mastered the precise art of occupying space without taking up room. It worked, mostly. As the executive operations manager for Maxim Varoff, the man the Montreal financial press called a venture capitalist, and the RCMP's organized crime division called something considerably less flattering, Brigid knew more about his empire than his accountants, his lawyers, and his 3 ex-wives combined. She knew the routing numbers of 17 shell companies registered in Luxembourg. She knew which city councillors attended his Westmount dinner parties and left with considerably more in their jacket pockets than they'd arrived with. She knew the precise moment each Thursday evening when the server room on the 42nd floor received an encrypted data packet from a source that did not officially exist. She knew, and she said nothing, and she was paid exceptionally well for that particular form of silence. What Brigid did not know, what she had spent 4 years carefully, deliberately not thinking about, was that Maxim Varoff had been watching her back. The night it all came apart began with a catering order and a broken elevator. It was the 3rd Thursday in November, which meant the Varoff Capital annual board dinner was in full swing on the 44th floor. Brigid had coordinated every detail. The flower arrangements flown in from a grower outside Quebec City, the sommelier borrowed from a 3 Michelin star restaurant in Old Montreal, the seating chart rearranged 4 times to account for 2 men who had not been in the same room since a business deal in 2019 that had ended with one of them in a hospital in Prague. She had done all of this, and then she had retreated, as she always did, to her desk on the 38th floor to work through the stack of contracts that had accumulated while she'd been managing the dinner logistics. The building was quiet. Most of the staff had been released at 5. The security team was concentrated on 44. Brigid had her shoes off under her desk, a cold takeout container of butter chicken at her elbow, and a highlighter in her hand. She heard the elevator doors open at 8:47 p.m. That was wrong. The service elevator to this floor required a keycard that only 4 people in the building possessed. Brigid was one of them. Maxim was another. The building's head of security, a former military officer named Sebastian, was the third. She did not wait to find out who had the fourth. 4 years of working adjacent to organized crime had given Brigid a very finely calibrated instinct for when a situation was about to become dangerous. She grabbed her laptop, her phone, and, by reflex so ingrained, it was almost funny, the highlighter. She moved into the server room 3 steps from her desk, pulled the door shut behind her, and engaged the manual lock. The voices that came through the wall were not speaking French or English. She recognized Russian. She did not speak it, but she had heard enough of it in 4 years of working for Maxim's to know what tense, clipped, professional Russian sounded like versus the fluid, social Russian she heard at the holiday parties. This was the former. These men were not here for the canapés on 44. Her phone had no signal inside the server room. The walls were reinforced, a feature Maxim had mentioned once, briefly, when she'd asked about the unusual thickness of the partition, and she had chosen not to examine his answer too closely at the time. She was crouched behind the secondary server rack, laptop open, trying to connect to the building's internal Wi-Fi when the door handle moved, then stopped. Then the lock engaged from the outside. Brigid went very still. The voice on the other side of the door was not the tense, clipped Russian she'd heard in the hallway. It was low, unhurried, and it belonged to Maxim Varoff. Brigid. Not a question, not an order, Just her name, in the particular tone he used when he already knew the answer to something and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. She exhaled through her nose. "I'm here. I know." A pause. "There are 4 men in the building who are not supposed to be here. Sebastian is handling it. I need you to stay in that room for approximately 25 minutes. I locked it from my side." "I know. I locked it from mine as well. That's—" She looked at the door. "That's redundant. It's cautious." Another pause, and she thought she could hear something in his voice that she had never heard there before, though she could not have named it precisely. "Are you hurt?" "No." I grabbed my laptop. The silence stretched for a moment. "Of course you did." She had worked for Maxim Varov for 4 years, 2 months and 11 days. In that time she had learned a great deal about him and had made a careful study of learning nothing more than what was strictly necessary. She knew he was 39 years old. She knew he had grown up in St. Petersburg and had arrived in Montreal at 22 with a duffel bag and a contact name written on a piece of paper that he'd since described. On the one occasion she'd heard him mention it, as a starting point. She knew he took his coffee without anything in it, and that he ate the same breakfast every day: black bread, soft cheese, 2 boiled eggs, and that he had not touched alcohol since 2017 for reasons no one in the organization discussed. She knew his ex-wives had all been extraordinary-looking women who had lasted, respectively, 18 months, 14 months, and just under 2 years. She had concluded, from all of this, that Maxim Varov was a man of very precise habits and very high standards, and that she, with her sensible shoes and her annotated contracts and her thorough invisibility, was not a person he thought about in any way that was not strictly professional. It had seemed for 4 years like a reasonable conclusion. She revised it somewhat, sitting in the dark behind a server rack while he stood on the other side of a reinforced door. "You've been managing the server access logs," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." You noticed the Thursday packets. The butter chicken container was still in her hand. She set it down carefully on the floor. "Yes." "And you said nothing. It wasn't my business to say anything." The silence that followed this was a different quality than the previous ones. "Most people who noticed would have said something," he said finally, "to someone, to the police or to my competitors, or they would have used it. Most people don't work for you for 4 years without understanding the general shape of what you do." "No," he said, "they don't." Another pause. "There are very few people I trust with the general shape of what I do, Brigid." She didn't answer, because she wasn't sure what the correct answer was, and she had learned long ago that silence was frequently better than a wrong word. "I need you to understand something," Maxim said, through the reinforced wall, in the dark building, while 4 men his security team was handling moved somewhere below them. "I did not hire you to be invisible. The server room was climate-controlled to a constant, cool temperature. But Brigid felt something shift in the air that had nothing to do with the HVAC system. You hired me to manage your operation, yes, and I have spent 4 years watching you make yourself as small as possible while doing it better than anyone I have ever employed." A beat. "I have been trying to decide what to do about that." She stared at the door. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer immediately. She heard something in the hallway. Footsteps, a brief exchange in French, then quiet again. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly different. "It means," he said carefully, "that I would like you to come to dinner tomorrow evening. Not a board dinner, not a work function. Dinner." Brigid sat very still in the dark for a long moment. "You're asking me on a date," she said finally, through a reinforced wall during an active security incident. "Yes, that's—" She stopped. "That's quite a way to ask someone to dinner. I had been intending to ask you for considerably longer than this evening," Maxim said, and his voice was entirely level, which made it somehow worse. "The circumstances are not ideal, but you're here, and I am here, and I have been watching you make yourself invisible for 4 years, and I would like very much for you to stop." She said yes. She told herself, in the days that followed, that it was the adrenaline. the locked room, the strange intimacy of two voices through a wall, the abstract danger somewhere in the floors below them. She told herself it meant nothing. She went to dinner on Friday evening at a restaurant in Outremont that had no sign above the door, where the owner greeted Maxim by name and showed them to a table in a private back room, and she told herself the whole drive home that it had been perfectly ordinary and professional, and she felt nothing unusual. She told herself this for approximately 6 weeks. On the evening of the 7th week, somewhere between the second glass of wine and the end of a conversation about her mother's family in Cape Breton that had somehow lasted 90 minutes, she admitted to herself that she had stopped believing it. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She had spent 4 years being furniture, useful, well-maintained, and entirely overlooked. She had made peace with that, or something that felt enough like peace that she'd stopped examining it too closely. She was 31 years old, and she had a master's degree in financial management, and she wore comfortable shoes, and she was not the woman men like Maxim Varoff looked at when they walked into a room, except that he did. He had, apparently, for a very long time. "You've been watching me," she said one evening, in his car outside her apartment building in NDG, and it came out with more weight than she'd intended. "Yes," he said, without any hesitation. "For how long?" He was quiet for a moment. "Since the first month. You found an error in the Luxembourg filing that my legal team had missed for 3 years. You corrected it, you documented your process, and you put the corrected file on my desk with a note that said, and I am quoting, flagged a discrepancy. Corrected, let me know if you'd like to discuss." A pause. "You didn't ask for recognition. You didn't leverage it. You just fixed it." Bridget remembered the file. She hadn't thought about it in years. "That was just doing my job." "Yes," Maxim said. "That's exactly what it was." He looked at her in the dark of the car. "You have no idea how rare that is." She looked down at her hands in her lap. They were not particularly remarkable hands. Broad, capable, ink-stained on the right index finger from the fountain pen she refused to give up. She was not a small woman, and she had spent a very long time treating that as a problem to be managed, a thing to minimize, to compensate for, to apologize for in 100 small daily ways that she had almost stopped noticing. She had dressed to disappear. She had taken up as little space as possible. She had made herself the most essential piece of an empire, and then stood quietly in the background of it, and she had told herself that was fine. Sitting in the dark beside Maxim Varoff, who was looking at her like she was the most significant thing in his considerable field of vision, she felt something crack open in the center of her chest that she had not even known was sealed shut. She found out on a Tuesday morning. She bought the test at a pharmacy in Côte des Neiges, as far from either her apartment or the office as she could justify on a Tuesday morning. She took it at home, alone in her bathroom, with the door locked as though someone might walk in, which was not possible because she lived alone and had always lived alone, and that had always been fine. The result was unambiguous. She sat on the edge of the tub for a long time. The bathroom was very quiet. Outside, the November rain was doing what November rain in Montreal always did, which was to be both relentless and somehow personal. She thought about what she knew about Maxim Varoff, the empire, the shell companies, the Thursday data packets, the ex-wives who had lasted 18 months and 14 months and just under 2 years. She thought about the men who did not speak English or French, who had come through the service elevator at 8:47 p.m. She thought about the fact that she was 31 years old and intelligent and practical, and she had still managed to arrive here, in this bathroom, with this particular problem. Then she got up, washed her face, and went to work. She was not going to be the woman who fell apart. She had never been that woman. She was the woman who found the error in the Luxembourg filing. She was the woman who corrected things quietly and documented her process. She had 2 weeks. She would figure it out. She did not figure it out. What she did instead was book a flight to Halifax, arrange for her apartment to be sublet to a colleague's daughter, transfer her most critical work files to the operations manager she had been quietly training for the previous 6 months, and write a resignation letter that was the most technically precise and emotionally arid document she had ever produced. She left it on her desk on a Wednesday evening. She was at the airport on Thursday morning when her phone rang. She knew the number. She had known it would be him. She let it ring. It rang again. She let it ring. "You left a resignation letter," Maxim said. His voice was entirely level. "Yes, it was very well written. Thank you." A silence. "Where are you?" "At the airport." Another silence, longer. "Brigid." And there it was again, just her name, just that, in the tone he had used through the locked server room door, and she hated that it still worked on her. She hated that her throat tightened on the word here that she did not say. "This is the right thing," she said instead. "You know that." "I know that you are at an airport," he said, "with a boarding pass that I suspect you believe solves a problem that you have not actually told me about." She closed her eyes. Around her, the Pierre Elliott Trudeau terminal was full of ordinary Thursday morning noise. Rolling suitcases, a child crying somewhere to her left, an announcement about a delayed flight to Vancouver. "Maxim, I know," he said. She opened her eyes. "Sebastien's team found the pharmacy bag," he said quietly. I'm not calling to." He stopped, and that was significant, because Maxim Varov did not stop in the middle of sentences. "I'm not calling to make demands. I'm calling because you are at an airport and you were going to leave without telling me, and I need you to understand that is not something I'm willing to let happen. You don't get to decide that." "No," he said. "You're right, I don't." A pause. I am asking you to come back, Brigid, not for the business, not for the another stop. Come back, because I have been watching you for 4 years make yourself invisible, and I have spent the last 3 months watching you stop doing that, and I am not willing to go back to the version of this where you disappear." The announcement for her flight began over the terminal speakers. She stood very still. "I don't fit," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Into your world, into the version of things you, the ex-wives, Maxim. I've met them. I know the shape of what you're supposed to want, and I am not it. I am 39 years old," Maxim said. "I have had 3 marriages that lasted an average of 16 months each, and not one of those women ever found a 3-year-old error in a Luxembourg filing, and not one of them ever sat in a locked server room in the dark and asked whether the locks were redundant." A pause. "You are the only person in 4 years who has understood the shape of what I do, and trusted me with that understanding. That is not something I will find again." The boarding announcement repeated. Brigid picked up her carry-on bag. She set it back down. "There's a lot we would need to talk about," she said. "Yes, I have conditions. I would expect nothing less," she exhaled. The child to her left had stopped crying. The terminal hummed around her with the ordinary business of a Thursday in November. People going places, people coming home. "I'm not going to disappear again," she said. "I spent 4 years making myself invisible, and I'm not doing it anymore. Not for anyone. Not for you." "Good," Maxim said, and she could hear something in his voice that she had heard only rarely, under careful ordinary conversation, like a current beneath still water. "I never wanted you to." She turned around. She did not go back to being furniture. She had decided, somewhere between the pharmacy in Côte-d'Ivoire and the departures terminal, and the boarding announcement she had not boarded for, that she was finished with that particular strategy. She had been good at invisibility. She had been, arguably, excellent at it, and it had cost her 4 years, and the slow accumulation of 100 small surrenders she hadn't noticed she was making until she was sitting alone in a bathroom on a Tuesday morning. The winter she spent learning the real edges of Maxim's world, not the sanitized version she'd managed from the operational side, but the full architecture of it, was not simple. There were men who looked at her and saw a liability. There were meetings where she walked in and felt the room recalibrate around her, reassessing, skeptical, waiting for Maxim to introduce her as an assistant, a consultant, something manageable and temporary. He didn't. He introduced her by name once and then treated it as settled, and she understood that this was its own form of declaration. She was 7 months along when the situation with the Vashchenko group came to a head, a detail she had seen coming in the operational data for 3 months before anyone else had flagged it, and which she brought to Maxim with a 40-page analysis and 2 proposed resolution frameworks on a Sunday morning in February in the kitchen of his house in Westmount, while the St. Lawrence was still frozen and the city was doing its annual stoic endurance of the last stretch of winter. He read all 40 pages. He looked up. "Framebrook B," he said. "I thought you'd say that. Framebrook A is better." "I know. You'll say B anyway because Bertrand won't accept A and you can't afford to lose Bertrand right now." A beat. He almost smiled. That particular Maxim Varov non-smile that she had catalogued extensively over 4 years and had recently started being able to read. "Framebrook B," he said again. "I'll draft the revised terms." He put the papers down and looked at her across the kitchen table, across the Sunday morning coffee and the black bread and the soft cheese and the ordinary evidence of a life being built between 2 people who had taken a very long detour to find each other. "You are going to be very difficult to work with," he said. "You should have thought about that before you asked me to dinner through a reinforced wall during a security incident." He did smile then, properly for once, which was rare enough that she felt it like something physical. "Yes," he said, "probably." Their daughter was born in April during a late-season snowfall that blanketed Westmount in white and muffled the city into unusual quiet. She arrived determined and loud, which Bridget found both exhausting and deeply satisfying. And Maxim held her with a focused, deliberate care that Bridget had only ever seen him apply previously to things he considered irreplaceable. He named her after Bridget's grandmother without being asked. That was the moment. Not the server room, not the airport, not the 40-page analysis on a Sunday morning. But that small, unannounced thing, the name chosen in the quiet way he chose the things that mattered most to him, that Bridget understood completely, and finally what she had been to him all along. The spring board meeting was the first one she attended, not as the person who had arranged it, but as the person who sat at the table. She wore the same competent colors, deep navy, structured lines, but she did not minimize. She took her seat without apology. She had the numbers memorized before anyone else in the room had finished opening their folders. Halfway through the meeting, one of the older board members, a man from Toronto who had been with Varov Capital since before Brigid had been hired, leaned toward the man beside him and said something in a low voice that she was not meant to hear. She heard it. I thought she was the assistant. Maxim, who was seated at the head of the table, and who had hearing that was, in Bridget's experience, inconveniently precise, did not look up from the document in front of him. "Bridget Calloway," he said, in his most ordinary boardroom voice, as though he were simply clarifying a line item, "is the reason this organization's Luxembourg holdings have been correctly registered for the past 4 years. She is also the reason the Vashchenko situation did not cost us 3 northern accounts last February." A pause. "And she is going to be leading the Q3 restructure." He turned a page. The room was quiet. Bridget looked down at the document in front of her to keep from doing something embarrassing with her expression. Under the table, she pressed her heel flat against the floor, grounded, present, exactly where she was supposed to be. She had spent 4 years becoming invisible, and she was done.